Hello and welcome to today's webinar put on by the Land Use Planning Community of Practice. This is a professional development webinar on the topic of Extension's role in renewable energy community engagement. My name is Brad Newman. I'm a senior extension educator with Michigan State University, and I am currently the chair of the Land Use Planning Committee of Practice. This is a webinar put on by the Community of Practice, not Michigan State University, although extension programs in general are open to all, and we want to have that same level of openness and accessibility in today's offering. We welcome you to share your feedback on your ability to register and join this webinar and access our information in our follow-up evaluation. I mentioned this is a professional development webinar by the Land Use Planning Committee of Practice. That group is a working group of NACDEP, the National Association of Community Development Extension Professionals. And that working group strives to provide timely, relevant information to citizens and extension professionals interested in land use planning, zoning, and sustainable development in general. Our Committee of Practice has a board of directors. You're seeing the full board here on your screen. I am the current chair. Jake Powell with Utah State University is our vice chair. Melissa Hamilton is a past chair. Kara Salazar with Purdue is our treasurer, and Peter Wolfhurst is our secretary. And you see Michael and Anna and Myra and Deborah, all from across the country representing different extension regions, and we strive to put on events like this throughout the year. And I just want to say thanks to the other members of the board for all the work throughout the year in pulling things like this off. Our board has some overall strategic goals. One of them is to offer relevant programming like this, the number 2 item on the screen. We also have a online self-paced course called American Citizen Planner, and we strive to make that program more accessible, utilized by more extension professionals and community members. More on that in just a minute. We're always interested in expanding our membership and improving our communications and sustaining ourselves as a community of practice. We have existed as a community of practice at the national level since the early days of e-extension, the name that predated the Extension Foundation. Our American Citizen Planner program is a training for professionals, extension professionals, local officials, and community members on land use planning and development regulation, including best practices in community development and sustainable development. And it is available through e-extensions or the Extension Foundation campus program. And there is a discount that we offer to extension professionals. If you're interested in learning more, reach out to me, and we're be happy to make this opportunity available to you and to others in your community and in your state. We'd encourage you to visit our website on the NACDEP website and to join our listserv. That information is here on the screen, and we'll be sure to include it in a follow-up email following today's webinar. Last, I just want to invite any current member of the COP to join a board meeting coming up. We usually have monthly meetings, and we're always looking for participation in those meetings and in recruiting prospective new board members. So please do reach out. With that as introduction, I want to invite Myra Moss, who is a board member on the COP, to introduce today's topic and our webinar presenters. Myra.
Thanks, Brad. Today's webinar is about Extension's role in renewable energy community engagement. And we have 3 speakers who come from different perspectives, and they have worked closely with developers, and they have worked closely with communities. So they're going to talk about some of the programs that they're engaged in and share their insights and expertise. A few kind of housekeeping chores before I introduce our first speaker, and that is we'd like to hold questions off until the end. However, if you do have a question, please write it in the chat. Michael Doherty from West Virginia University is going to be monitoring the chat, and if there's something really critical, he can then interrupt and ask that question. Otherwise, we will be waiting till the end to make sure we get through all the presentations. Next slide. Our three presenters are Davi Wilson, Sherry Gruder, and David Kay. And Davi is, for over a decade, she has dedicated her career to enhancing community engagement approaches for clean energy siting. Through her company, Siting Clean, she currently co-leads an initiative called the Siting Clean Collaborative, helping to advise and connect members of nonprofit, academic, renewables industry, and philanthropic sectors who are working to tackle the local challenges associated with siting and permitting clean energy infrastructure. Prior to starting Siting Clean, she served as a vice president of public affairs for Apex Clean Energy. So she has that developer private side experience. She holds a master's of environmental management from Yale University and a BA from Brown. So Davi, go ahead.
Great. Hello, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Nice to be with you all. So thanks so much for having me. I'm going to give a sort of high-level introduction to this topic, and then the other speakers will follow up with some more specific examples and stories of this work on the ground, and specifically with extensions. But I hope to just provide some background information here. So I'm going to proceed and then happy to answer any questions at the end, as was stated. So I thought it'd be helpful to begin with this question of why local permitting for clean energy projects matters. And some of you may already know this, so forgive me for those who this is review for, but I'll proceed just so everyone has the same shared background. So first of all, I think it's helpful to just have a sense of the scale of what folks are saying we're going to need to build in order to meet carbon goals. So looking at some relatively recent research by NREL, who modeled some different scenarios of how to reach national carbon goals, they estimated that we will need to build between 330 and 1,500 gigawatts of solar and 500 to 1,670 gigawatts of wind to decarbonize. And that assumes that we're not relying upon only renewables for decarbonization. If we're relying on only renewables, they said, we actually need to build twice that much. And just to give you a sense of what that really means, breaking that down a little further, you can calculate that between now and 2030 alone, so in the next 6 years, we'd need to build more than 500 gigawatts of new clean energy facilities. So if you try to, again, break it down a little farther, if we assume that a utility scale project is about 200 megawatts, that they're, some are bigger, some are smaller, but thinking about that as just sort of a standard, that's about 2,000 new projects. So that's more than twice what exists today that needs to get built in the next 6 years. And these model numbers are changing as they develop new models, but this is a recent estimate. It's a significant amount of infrastructure, and they'll have to build new transmission to accommodate that as well. Of course, a lot of this infrastructure is being proposed in some very specific regions in the country, the Midwest, the South, sort of Texas and Oklahoma, and then the Southeast, as well as the Southwestern states. So this infrastructure will not be evenly spread. It's likely going to be focused in certain regions. We're going to feel a tremendous amount of pressure. And some are already feeling it, as I'm sure many of you could attest. By comparison, the largest clean energy build year to date, 2021, saw the installation of 28 gigawatts. So you could see how this math starts to add up. I mean, you get the point. This is a lot of new infrastructure, and it's going to create a lot of pressure on some limited portions of the country. So how do these developers that are trying to build all this stuff decide where to go? I thought this might be some helpful information as well. So from a developer perspective, I think this is a high-level introduction to what they're looking for that's driving them towards these limited regions. First of all, and most importantly, they're looking for transmission capacity and reasonable upgrade costs. I say this is the most important thing because this is probably the biggest single factor determining where projects can be built. We are not in a time today of great abundance here. We're actually in a time of great constraint here. There is not a lot of available transmission capacity. And the places where there is capacity, I'm sure you would recognize because there's a lot of developers there. Everybody's being forced into those same locations. And while there may be other communities that would be interested in hosting these facilities, if there aren't developers there, it's likely because there isn't transmission access right now. So transmission access does not only mean a transmission line running through, it actually means that the way that that network or grid system is working there will allow for new injections of energy where those projects won't be curtailed or shut down because of like congestion, say, on the line. So if you imagine the transmission system looking sort of like the highway system, similarly, there can be traffic, there can be congested areas. And if you build a project in a place with congestion, then you might get your project shut down. You won't be able to operate it at full capacity. And so those projects typically are less likely to get financed at all. So you can see where these developers who are working in this market environment are only going to those places where they think they can afford the upgrades they're going to need to pay to get on the system there, and where there's enough capacity to let them run their project. So once you find those places, developers are really focused on zones where a project can be financeable and marketable and competitive. So the clean energy projects in this country are built by private entities who need to seek financing for these projects in many cases. And that means they compete economically in a marketplace. So that they can only go to places, or projects will only be successful in places where they're marketable. And that means that even in some places where there is transmission, maybe these are not places where you can have an economically viable project, or where you're going to find a power off-taker from the power generated by that project, or maybe you're not even allowed to find a public or a private buyer of energy there because there's no energy market in that region of the country. So that is another factor that really determines where developers go. Third, they need to look for places with no disqualifying impacts like airspace, wildlife, radar, wetlands, and topography have to be right for the technology that they're looking at. And of course, land use matters too. These projects get built primarily in rural communities because that's where the land use is most compatible, or the residential density is low enough to allow for this kind of infrastructure. So that's me. I put third on the list as that set of qualifications. Of course, you need a good wind and solar resource, wind or solar resource in a location, so that matters. But I actually put that down on the list because the newer technology is allowing for more flexibility there. And finally, last, I'd put they're looking for a predictable or amenable policy environment. That might be state policy, but it also might be local policy. So this is where we'll be focusing today. This is really important, but unfortunately, it's usually at the end of this long list of things that developers are considering when they're trying to find a place that's viable for a project. I did want to note that I think there are some shifting priorities among developers now. It does feel like at this moment, we're for the first time seeing conditions where there's more demand for these projects than there is supply of permitted and ready to go projects. And with that, I think the value of certainty in a project is growing relative to the value of just the cost. So previously, these projects were competing against each other on price of energy with potential off-takers of power. Now I think we're going to start seeing them also competing around certainty. It's no good for a power buyer to commit to a project and use that project in their planning for their energy goals if that project never gets built. So I think in the near term here, we're going to start seeing a shift where the value of certainty is higher than the cost. And that is important because that provides hopefully new opportunities for community engagement and more earlier investment in communities that might increase certainty relative to cost. So getting back to this question of why does local matter? This is a map that was put together by an organization I work with. This shows the level of local control and influence over siting decisions in each state in the country. This is very simplified. We tried to group categories here just to make this a little easier to interpret. But what this means, light blue here, means that there is either fully state permitting, so state has full preemption authority or full control, or no effective permitting at all. On the other end of the scale, a 5 means the permitting for these projects is fully local. It's at the county or township or town level, and there is no state authority at all. Everything in between is some version of a hybrid that looks different in different places. But what you can see on this map is that a lot of states are marked 4 and 5. And in particular, a lot of states with a lot of clean energy capacity are marked 4 and 5. Probably over 50% of the clean energy megawatts currently in the queues around the country are in states that we've marked 4 or 5 here. So that is why local matters. It has a huge amount of impact on what can get built. Many of you know this, so I'll run through this quickly, but local permitting for clean energy projects happens in a couple of different ways. This is different in every state in the country. So again, this is generalized, but just to give a general sense of how this often works. Often land use processes like ordinance processes, zoning regulations, these are the kinds of processes that communities are using to determine where projects can go and what kind of projects are allowed. So that will look like wind ordinances or solar ordinances. In some cases, it will look like moratoria, where they put a temporary ban or a permanent ban on clean energy projects while they consider a new ordinance, or just indefinitely because they don't think they belong there. In some states, they're allowed to create exclusion zones. For example, in Ohio, a notable state passed legislation not long ago that gives counties authority to create exclusion zones, which specifically eliminate clean energy in a place that's outside of the typical zoning process. But in a lot of places, once these ordinances are created or zoning regulations, projects have to seek approval through a special use permit or a conditional use permit. So that is typically where conversations about these projects really sort of come to a head in local communities, either through the ordinance conversation or later through the permit application. Oh, sorry about that. So what's happening out there is a little bit alarming and hard to get your arms around because the data doesn't exist right now to do the comprehensive analysis. But NREL did take a look at this. They made an attempt to collect a bunch of wind and solar ordinances around the country from different local governments. Their database was wildly incomplete, but they did make an attempt and start on it. And then they ran some analysis where they looked specifically at setbacks. So setbacks are one element of the kinds of provisions that typically go into an ordinance. Other elements might be sound regulation or height regulation or visual regulation or even zoning, zone limitations, what kinds of zones wind or solar projects are allowed in. But in this case, they only looked at setbacks, and they looked at the data, and they grouped all of the existing ordinances into categories where they marked it as sort of an extreme level setback, which they called 90th percentile here, or no setback at all. And then they looked at a 50% percentile in the middle. With that data, they started to do some modeling for what would happen if the counties in the country that are not currently regulated this way, if they passed 90th percentile restrictions on setbacks. And what you can see here is this orange bar. Capacity potential in the country decreases quite significantly if you assume that more counties pass these highly restrictive ordinances. They extrapolated that to say that if you take that across the country, you would reduce wind capacity and solar capacity by 87% and 38% respectively, depending on the size of the setback. So significant impact to our potential in this country. And that's only looking at setbacks. If you started to look at other features such as, say, zoning restrictions on ag lands that are getting applied in the solar case, you'd see that solar number decrease significantly, but they did not consider that here. So that just shows you how big of an impact this could have. We don't have the data to say exactly what's really happening out there now, but anecdotally, more and more counties are passing restrictive ordinances or bans. And so this is having a significant impact on potential to meet these carbon goals. Why are communities saying no? There's a lot of different theories. I'm just going to run through some of them. First, some folks say, well, there's insufficient engagement from developers. They're just not out there enough. They're not providing enough information. And communities are saying no because they don't have good information. Another theory is that the benefits are insufficient. It's a nice idea to have clean energy projects that benefit communities, but clearly the benefits aren't great enough, or more communities would be saying yes. So there's, some folks who believe that these projects just aren't benefiting locals enough to make it worth the impact for them. Some say the processes just aren't good. The ordinance process, the moratoria process, permitting, They just allow people to stand up for 2 minutes each and state their claim and make their case, but they don't promote really engaged dialogue about these difficult conversations, these difficult choices in a community, and that's leading to bad outcomes. Certainly, there's disinformation in the mix. If you go online to do your own research, which many folks do when they're trying to learn about a new technology, there's a lot of things online that are quite scary. A lot of them aren't true, but a lot of them do have an impact, and they enter into these conversations happening in communities, and lead local decision makers to struggle to know what's true and what's not true and which sources to trust, and that's certainly a factor. Some say there's just really a silent majority effect at play, that really there is more support for clean energy in these communities. It's just that those folks aren't showing up, and that the people that we hear most from is this minority of folks who are really opposed. There's some evidence of this, although, I'm not, there's definitely evidence that supporters show up generally less than opponents on any issue. But, that's one theory that's out there. And then finally, some say, this is about sense of place attachment. These communities recognize that these projects are a threat to their sense of place. And they're saying no, because they don't think they fit there. This kind of infrastructure is in conflict with their sense of what's important in their community. So I wanted to run through all of those because when you ask the question, what can be done, there's a couple categories of work, and you've seen some of this, I'm sure, and we could talk more about it if you'd like. First of all, there's a set of strategies around better local outcomes. So there are organizations working on how do we create better local processes that promote more effective dialogue. Several extensions are involved in this conversation around the country, so that's really exciting. They're talking about how maybe they can facilitate better conversations and planning around this that might help communities more, fairly evaluate the choices before them. There are efforts to create more decision maker education and resources for these county officials as they make these decisions. Some of you may have heard of the R-STEP program that's been launched by Department of Energy that would allow for funding to create coalitions in states to create their own hubs to help promote decision maker education and provide technical resources to these local officials making these decisions. Some are saying, look, the supporters are out there, they're just not organized. We need more efforts to organize them so that they'll show up and make their voices heard in this conversation. So some are focused on that. Some are focused on just better communications around the benefits of these projects. There is evidence that a lot of these projects do have very significant economic benefits for the communities where they're built, but there's a sense that those stories aren't being told, and they're being overwhelmed by some of the more negative fears about what these projects might bring. So investment in more communications. There's definitely folks working on this benefits idea. How could community benefit agreements be richer for communities? How could they be negotiated in more inclusive ways that involve more people and get more support? So work happening on that. And then there are some folks also engaging in local elections, wanting to make sure that these conversations are a part of elections when local folks are getting into these county offices, and that folks who are open to clean energy ideas are in those seats. On the other side of the strategy, I'm going to wrap up here, is that state policies are in discussion as well. So many states are currently considering how to rebalance their authority. Some of those states that have had full local control in the past are thinking about whether they need to, rebalance that, create more of a role for the state in that process. Illinois recently did this. California did this in 2022. So Illinois was last year. California was 2022. New York was prior to that. All three of these states have different strategies for how they're approaching this, which we could talk about more if you'd like. But there are different approaches to what these policies might look like. And finally, Michigan just passed a bill at the end of last year, which would go into effect at the end of this year. That bill, there's a challenge to that right now, so we'll see what happens, but that they took yet a different approach to this question. And then you've got states like Texas and Florida, which are actually going the opposite direction. They're thinking about how to create more restrictions on clean energy, and so they are using similar tools, but with the opposite intent. So I'm going to wrap up there. That was super fast, but would be glad to talk more about any of that at the end, and I'm going to pass it on to the next presenter.
Right. Before you go, Davi, there was one quick question
Yes.
that was just a technical one. What's the average setback in most cases? Do we know that?
Oh, that's a great question. So that is in the NREL data. I would be happy to pull a link to that research and share that. NREL has a national database of the ordinances it did collect and they're broken down by category to allow analysis so that I can get you that link. I'll work on that.
Okay.
In the meantime, just to point out that's already out of date and it's wildly incomplete. But I will provide it. It's some of the best that we've got right now.
Okay, then we'll share that with participants. The other question, more of a policy one, we'll wait for the larger discussion on.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Davi. It's interesting getting that national perspective because that's something we don't always or don't often focus on since we're so embroiled in our local state policies. So thank you. Our next speaker is Sherry Gruder, and she's a distinguished sustainable design specialist and energy strategist with UW-Madison Division of Extension. She provides statewide education and technical assistance on sustainable community development, clean energy strategies, and green building to support the resilience and economic vitality of Wisconsin communities, local governments, tribes, and businesses. She manages the Great Lake Environmental Justice Technical Assistance Center program for Wisconsin to assist remote rural communities and tribes with accessing federal funding. And I just had to bring that up because I'm involved with our TICTAC also in Ohio. So go ahead, Sherry.
Great, thank you so much. Very glad to be here with all of you. So I'm going to talk to you today about what UW-Madison Extension is doing with large-scale solar development. And if I could have the next slide. So this is really a project nested in other projects. So we got a grant or a subaward from a national grant that the Berkeley National Lab was running with Michigan State University, University of Michigan, and also NRail. And it's called Community Centered Solar Development, and it's a 3-year project. This is the 3rd year. And the goal of it is to improve solar development processes and outcomes for all of the stakeholders. And if you look at this diagram, the first 4 tests, they've already worked on. They've done national surveys. They're creating a map of all the large-scale solar sites in the country. And they're looking at the financing, economic analysis of everything. And then task 5 is what we're involved with, which is the community-based solutions. So in Wisconsin, and there are 2 groups that are doing the first pilot, and that's Wisconsin and Michigan. And so in the first, so our team that I put together has a specialist from community development, but also from our Ag Institute. We have 2 county-based educators, one who's actually in the county where the project is that we're working on, and also the extension area director, who's very well known and connected in that area. And then also one of your board members, Anna Haynes, from our Center for Land Use Education. Next slide, please. So the goal of community-centered solar and development is to center the community's values and objectives in the large-scale solar development project and process. And so what we are going to do, and what we have already started doing, is to design, execute, and document an inclusive participatory planning process. So it's not just, as Davi said, the angry people, who speak louder and show up, but everybody gets to be part of it, and do a community engagement process where the community members are heard and their vision is developed. The developers address the community concerns and their values, and we think that will lead to the community benefiting and prospering. We heard about community benefit agreements. That would be part of it. And also we think that this will reduce community tension. when we started our process, we looked at, many of you might be familiar with it, but the IAP2 levels of engagement, and it's the International Association for Public Participation, and they created a scale of levels of engagement, and just informing people is not enough. And so what we're doing is looking to be somewhere in that middle ground where people, we can't empower them, but what we can do is let them, let their ideas be heard and engage them in the process and have some ability to influence the project. Next slide, please. So the project that we're doing, it kind of has three parts. So in order to satisfy our grant, what we're doing is we're contributing a step-by-step replicable curriculum and approach to a process for community engagement, looking at impacts and perceptions and proactive planning. In order to do that, though, we chose Portage County, and in Portage County, we're looking to engage the community so that they do feel that their vision and values are coming out. We are doing this using human subject research, so we've had to go through we are still going through an IRB process. And I should say, this isn't a completed project, so I can't give you results. I could just tell you the process that we're using. And, but come April, we should be done with all the field work and writing up the, how we did it. And then and also testing it then to see if it's replicable and to get input from others who have tried it. And so based on what we're responsible for in the grant, it's how can the development of solar facilities contribute to and advance the long-term vision and prosperity of Portage County. And then, of course, being part of Extension, whatever we learn from this, we're going to develop the process and resources for the entire state so that other Extension educators can use it, apply it, and respond when people in their communities ask for assistance. So next slide, please. So as you heard from Davi, there really is a rapid clean energy transformation occurring. And in Wisconsin, actually, Anna's group looked at if we had 100% renewable energy in our state, about 32% of it would come from large-scale solar systems. The reality of that, it would only use about 1% of our total land area or 6% of our ag land that's planted in soybean and corn. And I should point out that we do grow a lot of corn for ethanol in Wisconsin, which solar provides 100 times more the energy resource than ethanol does. So it is a better land use in that regard if you're using it as an energy crop. Anyway, currently we already have 33 large-scale solar developments either in process or actually built in 21 of our 72 counties, and 13 of them have battery storage. And then in terms of what state are we and how do our laws affect it, on that map, we were the number 2. Our state says that a large-scale solar project is defined as anything 100 megawatts or greater. And so at that point, it's up to the Public Service Commission and not the local jurisdictions to approve or regulate a project. So there is a public process where they, can show up at the PSC public comment period, but other than that, they can't say no to a project. What we're trying to do is help them know at what points, and especially early on, get involved so that they can influence the project and that there's more input from them. Next slide, please. So the communities we're working with, we chose Portage County, one, because the county exec actually came to our area extension director and wanted to be part of this. They already have two large-scale solar developments going on. One that's a 250 megawatt project that's a little over 2,000 excuse me, acres. And that one already has been permitted by the PSC. And then another one that's ongoing now, which is 1.2 gigawatts. And we're talking about 9,000 acres of land in the same county. And you can see that one is the purple and the other is that salmony color. So they're also very different because the smaller one, which is still 250 megawatts, involved about 50 landowners, whereas the second one, the one that's not permitted yet, and that's so huge, really only involves, I think it's 10 or maybe 12 large farm concerns. They're potato growers. So it doesn't affect the community in the same way or the smaller landowners as much. So, so what we are able to do is to talk to community members and see how this impacted them and what happened in the process, et cetera, and learn from these communities. But we are not catching them at the way beginning of the process, which would actually be quite helpful. Next one, please. So the process we're using, we set up an advisory group that's local to actually help us with our process. I mean, obviously, as extension professionals, we know how to facilitate, but what we're looking for from them is that very key people feel like they have input into the process that we're going to run in their community. So we set up this group. We've already met with them. It was very eye-opening, and they gave us background information. We got a sense of the local situation, actually the local culture. We talked about the focus groups we're going to run and people to include, and then we're going to run larger public community conversations. And so we will tap into them for that and also for getting the word out about it. We also made sure to ask them whether they were approached by the developer and whether they were under contract. We thought that was important from other experience we've had in other counties where actually people who've been county board chairs or town board chairs for 30 years were kicked out because they entered into an agreement with a developer. So we wanted to know who we were working with and if that was going to turn up to be an issue for us and bite us. Okay, next slide, please. So the next thing we're doing is we're doing interviews, and we're doing them with educators and planners and local government officials who, and we are going to do them with the developers of the two developments who have already been involved in this to find out what they learned, and especially about process. And this photo is an unfortunate one where 100 people out of a town of 800 showed up. And it was only the angry people, and they all were so organized, and they had shirts on that said, no solar development. So anyway, we want to get there early. We wanted to make sure that we don't have just that voice coming up and drowning out everything else. Next slide, please. So we are holding focus groups, and so those are very intentional. They're by invitation only. We are going to, through our grant, be able to fund their participation, and we're going to run 7 focus groups. One will be public officials, which would be not just elected officials, but also planners and others who would be involved. Farmers who have entered into contracts for for each of the projects. Also, the landowners and adjoining properties. So we found out from the earlier work that Michigan did on the community-centered solar design that there was the bigger influence was on communities within a mile, or, you know, obviously against also the land where it's going to be. So we're going to concentrate on that. And we're also, we wanted to, you know, make sure that we looked at this from a Justice 40 perspective. And I did look at the CGIS maps and found that there were no Justice 40 census tracts in the county. It's very rural, but it doesn't line up with that, with being called, you know, Justice 40 communities. We did want to make sure that we got some voices that wouldn't normally be heard, so we decided to invite youth because it is really about their future. And of course, that puts a lot of headaches on us because it is human subjects research. And when you're involving youth, then that takes a lot more work. But anyway, we are going to try to get them there, like future farmers of America and the environmental club at the high school or whatever. And of course, local leaders and environmental leaders. Next slide, please. So our process design is, you know, typical of focus groups. We will be providing consent forms and funding. We're going to use a semi-structured question process so that we can do follow-up questions, that we didn't just have to submit and exactly ask the questions that we submitted to the IRB review board. We're looking to hear different perspectives in that, and we're encouraging that. We will electronically record it. These will not be made public. We will code the transcripts and analyze them. But the whole goal is to get from them the understanding of community concerns, any conflicts, what worked for them, what isn't, what their perceptions are, perceptions versus maybe reality or data-based information. And then to use that as the basis of the larger community conversations that we're going to hold. So those we will be doing in February. We're setting them up now. Next slide, please. And we've put together the questions because I had to submit them to IRB, and these are the categories that they're in, but they range from experiences in communicating and negotiating with the developer. I think transparency. We already heard from our advisory committee that the town board chair didn't even know that the developers were there until after they already had gotten the contracts for local landowners. Perceptions of community involvement in the project. You know, developers do hold public process, but people don't, you know, they often don't feel like that's a way for them to actually really participate. They're just being informed. And that's the difference with what we're doing. We're going to talk to them about potential benefits, challenges that they have, and then recommendations for the future for this project and others to help us with, you know, coming up with a process that is rooted in community comfort and engagement. Next slide. So the community conversations will be public. They'll be at a local comfortable community gathering site. They will we will facilitate equitable engagement of our stakeholders. It will give us an opportunity to do some preliminary education. I did paste on this slide the flyer that the developer sent out to people I think that we will use the themes that we used in the focus group to shape this. I think what's really interesting and to me especially is that in the state of Wisconsin, when there is a large scale solar or wind development, the local communities as well as the counties get money annually for the entire life of the project once the project is actually operational. And that is not something that local government officials have involved the communities in terms of how to use that money. So a lot of them don't even know that they're benefiting. And so it was interesting because this developer actually put the actual numbers out there for what each of the townships in that development, you know, what their total revenues are and their property tax collection and what they're going to get from this project. And so that, you know, we will make sure to have discussions about that. And then the whole idea is really to do deep listening and to make them feel heard because they currently, given that 100 megawatt rule at the state, they don't feel heard. And next slide. And that's where you can reach me. I run a program called Energy on Wisconsin, where all of this, especially when we create the resources, will be placed. So thank you.
I just have one quick clarifying question. Person want to know those number of the property owners affected. Are those just the property owners where the panels are, or is it on their land, or the lines run across their land, or is it something else?
So we will have focus groups with the property owners who, you know, got a contract, so that will be on their land. But the other ones are actually the people who live tangential, right, next to those developments. So that's, I think, what I was talking about.
Well, the 10 and 50 on the slide right at the beginning of it, the potato farmers and the.
So no, those are the landowners that got contracts or got leases for their land.
Those are the ones who are actually going to have the solar panels, and then there's others who might be affected who'll be in different groups. Just a clarifying question. Okay.
Yeah, so the ones with the solar panels, they're so different between the two developments because one are smaller landowners and a lot more of them, and the other are very big, you know, businesses.
Great. Sherry, thanks very much. That model you're producing is going to be very helpful, I believe, for other extension educators and community-based people throughout the US. So we'll be really interested in finding out what your results are on that. Okay, our final speaker then is David Kay, and he's the Senior Extension Associate, Department of Global Development. And this is at Cornell. He's currently serving as Department Extension Leader. He provides leadership for specific programming in the areas of energy, land use, community development, and regional economics. He does research, outreach, and training efforts that attempt to build community-based decision-making capacity. He's focused on the community and economic development implications of energy transitions and climate change and relationship between local and global. And currently he is the chair of NECI, which is the National Extension Climate Initiative. So go ahead, David.
Hi, can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you for the great setup that Davi and Sherry passed on to me. I'm going to kind of talk very little bit about my own state, New York, but mostly try and come at this issue from a broader national extension perspective. So to begin with, I just wanted to highlight the extent to which or the way I really got involved deeply, particularly in New York State, when we think about renewables, there's offshore wind and onshore solar. So I'm primarily involved from a land use perspective in onshore solar. We had for many years a group of extension educators and some community members called the Community Energy Program Work Team that I was a co-chair of with a county-based educator. And several years ago, we didn't have any ag educators on that list, but solar prospecting was starting in New York. And what happened is we got approached by a number of ag educators who said, hey, this is an important thing happening in our communities. You guys are already looking at some of these issues. Why don't we take a new look at this issue from the perspective of the energy educators and the ag educators together? So that's kind of brought us together within New York State. And we have a very robust group of educators with some people not extension affiliated also joining us who are looking at these issues. One of the things I wanted to do just to kind of reinforce and maybe elaborate a little on some of the things that the previous presenters put out there and also introduce you to some resources that you might find useful is to kind of look at the broad context here. So here's one of those resources which just released a few months back that comes out comes out of some of the work that Sherry was actually referring to at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And they have an online database that shows us a pretty comprehensive, not 100% comprehensive look at what solar, and by the way, I'm going to focus like Sherry did on solar. I well recognize that there are other forms of renewables, and that in fact, in terms of community participation, we have a long history that we've learned a lot from in relation to wind in particular, but I'm going to focus on solar too. So this database looks at capacity that's in place, 1 megawatt or more solar as of 2022. You can see the URL is kind of an overview of all the places in the US and look at the geography there. This is again what's already in place. And here's a little blow up of New York's database. That is what I look at the most, and you'll see numbers here in New York, 229 projects, a little 3/4 of a gigawatt of capacity in place in New York. So maybe remember that 3/4 of a gigawatt number and put it in the context of what you've heard before and you'll be hearing now from me. So what is in place in New York? We have what we call utility scale solar, and I will say large utility scale. This terminology is not uniform from place to place. So you're going to hear different definitions of where the cutoffs are, but we only actually have a very small amount of what I would call large scale utility solar actually in operation in New York. 9 of the facilities shown are 25 megawatts or less. We have one that's 32 megawatts. That one has been in place for a while. It's on Long Island, at Brookhaven National Labs. So the main point here, which I'm going to highlight a little more, is what's already in place. So this chart is again a New York chart. It's showing what is in planning in New York as of this is a couple of years ago, and I'm going to update it in just a second. The main takeaway from this for us is so this is not looking at any very small projects or what we might call distributed projects, distributed scale solar, which is in New York defined as 5 megawatts or less. There's a lot that's gone on in that realm. But here what you're going to see is the blue bars show the number of projects as of a couple of years ago, and the red line shows the capacity in each of these size categories as you move from left to right. So basically the takeaway, as I say, there are a lot of 20 megawatt proposals in New York. We can go into the reasons for that if you want to, but most proposed capacity, however, is coming from the very largest facilities, which kind of makes sense. And here's another element that we've talked about already in the previous presentations. What the local government in New York has jurisdiction over 20 megawatt projects, and goes through environmental review under state law as well. The larger projects go through state review. Just to update this number to a few months ago, the key, we're talking here 20 gigawatts of proposed capacity in over 200 projects at this point. And almost all of that is in what I would call large projects from the perspective of a local government, even though they're not as large as some of the ones we just heard about in Wisconsin. Takeaway for this, for our state and many other states, there's a lot more in the pipeline to come. In New York, we have seen very little of what we need to put in place over the next 7 to 20 years. And also just say, to kind of elaborate a little on some of the messages previously here, even in our state where local government permitting authority for renewables has been mostly preempted for large facilities. And I just showed you where we're expecting most of the onshore renewable electricity to be generated in large projects. Nonetheless, I think it's really important to underscore, and I think Sherry and Davi both kind of mentioned this as well, local governments still have input to state level decisions, even if they're not the ultimate decider. And in our state, local governments retain responsibility for reviewing and permitting a very large number of facilities, which are not necessarily small at 100 acres from the perspective of the neighbors or the landowners or the community. I wanted to throw this out as a benchmark, just in case, because I don't think anybody's done this yet. Like, how do you translate megawatts into acres? So used to be that we would talk about 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. The latest research I've seen that's national looks at about 3 to 7 acres per megawatt. So I usually use 5 as an average because it's easy to multiply. But that gives you, from a land use perspective, when you hear megawatts, multiply by 5, and you're going to get a reasonable sense of how much land is being affected. I think we already heard a little bit about, especially from Sherry, about farmland being affected. Recent paper came out by the American Farmland Trust that projects over 80% of projects nationally could be sited on agricultural land. It does not say it will be. I think all these numbers are super suspect when you get too precise about them, but the basic conclusion that farmland is very attractive in most places to site solar is looking at some of the criteria that Davi was putting up there. Ag land is good for this, just like it's good for growing crops, and it's also good for growing houses in many cases. So this is attractive land for a lot of things, including solar development. Because of that, I'll just also mention, I can't remember whether people have talked about agrivoltaics already, but this is co-location of solar with agricultural enterprises. It's a topic of huge interest in a lot of quarters. Some people are believing, many people are hoping that it will kind of like enable everybody to have their cake and eat it too, in terms of agriculture and solar going on. There's a lot of interesting work that's really just picking up momentum in the United States about this issue. I think that also the agrivoltaics topic is also one, and because of the amount of farmland being connected with or being impacted by solar, there's a particularly large open door for people in the land grant university system to walk through. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of quickly provide a little bit of national context, mostly on the research side. I don't need to do this one because this is what Sherry was already talking about, but this is a funded project with research and some extension components to it, which you all just heard about. Here's another one, the FARMS program, Foundational Agrivoltaic Research for Megawatt Scale. Funded program, there were 6 awards that went out. $8 million total went to this. Here's another one about looking at, not specifically at agriculture, but looking at ecosystem benefits. 15 million went out for funding on 9 projects nationally. Here's another one, the Seeds for call, which is actually still open at the moment or has not been announced yet. Again, this is looking at community acceptance and opposition, permitting and land use planning processes and outcomes, community impact evaluation. So that's kind of right up our alley for this topic. Be very interesting to see what comes out of this. It's primarily research work. The message there being the federal government is really interested in how to make these processes work better than they are now. And here's a more very interesting one that we applied for, and I know some of my colleagues have applied for. I think Sherry's team also applied for this at a state level, renewable energy siting through technical engagement and planning, some more funding. This one was particularly interesting to me because the call explicitly named university extension offices in collaboration with state energy offices as the most desirable leads for these projects. I don't see that very often where we get called out that way. I wanted to almost finally also mention work being done by one of my colleagues, or being led by one of my colleagues at Cornell in our Department of City and Regional Planning, who's working on creating a national zoning atlas. Super ambitious project. I didn't actually believe it was worth paying any attention to until I heard how far she's already gotten with her teams around the country, because it's a lot of data, sort of hard work getting data and sort of organizing it. It's more ambitious than I think what Davi was talking about in terms of the NREL data, in part because it actually puts boundaries in a GIS or and shape files around the each of the zoning categories. So we actually have a proposal in right now to the National Technologies for Ag Extension, which may or may not get funded, to try and build in a solar component to this existing online database. And I just want to end with a reminder about what our extension system is. This is from the national website. What the extension system says we're all about, empowering farmers, ranchers, and communities of all sizes to meet the challenges, etc. So the question I would pose to you all is, what is our role, assuming we're affiliated with NACDEP, which many of us are, but more broadly, members with community economic development expertise regarding this. We've laid out some ideas, but we want to hear from you all too about what you think our role could and should be. And my final slide is just about, some of you may have been aware that every couple of years there has been a joint extension summit that initially combined the National Extension Energy Summit with the National Sustainability Summit. We did this at Penn State in 2022. And there's planning for a renaming it, rebranding it, National Extension Climate and Energy Summit 2024, which NECI will be a co-sponsor of. And that is likely to be in Madison, Wisconsin.
It will be in Madison.
Yeah, I haven't gotten permission to announce that yet. So,
I'm sorry.
so that's why I said likely. So maybe it will be.
Okay, David, thank you very much. And I'm going to quickly turn it over to Michael, who's going to handle some question and answers. Michael?
Okay, can someone let me show since I'm doing Q&A now, my video had gotten stopped before when I came in, unless you wanted me to be a disembodied voice. Okay, well, first of all, I have want to thank all of our panelists. Couple of questions that were put in the chat. I left them for this point because one probably has been answered. I'll do that one first. The other is more broad comment. One is, why are the greatest proposed developments in the Midwest and South? What factors are playing into that? I think we heard that during Davi's presentation, but we'll let you just confirm what I thought I heard. If anyone wants to address that.
Sure. I think that, yeah, it's a combination of factors. I think historically it was more influenced by the actual resource because the technology really required a certain sort of quality of wind or quality of solar in order to make a project viable. But now the technology's gotten better and better, and that's less of a barrier now. So now I think the primary thing that's driving where companies go is transmission access, and then the market access that's going to allow them to, have a lot of potential buyers for the energy, because that's what actually gets the projects built.
That makes sense. And I think Davi's presentation gave a good piece on what considerations people are looking at. There was a request for someone to speak on interconnection barriers. And I'll just throw that open to all of the participants.
Yeah, I can take a stab. But this is not my area of expertise, as a caveat here. But yeah, hopefully that discussion of how the transmission system works is helpful. But to go just a little deeper, the transmission system in the United States is broken into grid regions. So several regions of the country have market operators, regional market operators that manage that whole portion of the system. They make sure the right amount of energy is on the grid at any given time, and that different types of entities are putting energy onto the grid. In those places, those are parts of the country that have what they call a regional transmission organization, or RTO, or sometimes it's called an independent systems operator, an ISO. So in some cases, those are regional. They include multiple states. In other cases, they're state specific. So for example, California has its own, Texas has its own, and there are other examples. So those are these sort of larger systems that are managing how energy goes on the grid. And in places where there's a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator, those are places where other kinds of companies can actually buy power on the market. So companies like Amazon and Meta and, you name it, corporation that has a clean energy goal, can actually enter into an agreement for clean energy in those marketplaces. It's not limited to utilities. But in other regions of the country where there is no regional system, like most of the Rocky Mountain West, Pacific Northwest, the Southeast right now, in those regions, the utilities manage their own grid systems. There's no kind of inter-utility regionalization there. And so in those cases, the developers are limited to trading and having these contracts with the utilities themselves. So those factors also influence where companies go, because when you're working with a smaller number of customers, you have fewer options. So that is another factor of the transmission and interconnection challenge. But the last piece, so we talked about transmission availability and capacity and upgrade costs. We talked about the markets. The last piece is that the interconnection queues themselves are not working very well, meaning that basically they're called queues, like they're lines. So it's the way a new generator gets in line to get on the system. Each grid system has its own process, and a lot of them are super backed up. So they're way overloaded. A lot of the projects that are in those queues will probably never get built. But the way a lot of these systems are set up, this is one of the earliest sort of tickets to play that a developer has to get to make sure they have a viable project. They have to have a spot in line. And because these are so backed up and the groups that are responsible for managing those queues are under-resourced, this has also become a huge barrier. So there's been recent action by FERC to try to amend those processes, but that's very complicated. It's a whole other challenging issue.
David, you wanted to add to that, it looks like?
Yeah, I think Davi just did a great job. I'll just highlight a couple things. One is that, you know, I think a lot of people would agree that that this issue of access to the grid and, you know, having a 21st century grid that can accommodate renewables is one of the top 2 or 3 biggest barriers to the country, and at least states that are very aggressively trying to decarbonize. It's one of their biggest barriers, along with this issue of community acceptance. I mean, those are amongst the 2 biggest ones. And just to clarify, maybe slightly at a more fine-grained level of what Davi was just saying, like, you can't just go to your RTO or ISO and say, hey, I've got a great project, like, sign me up and like, let's go. There needs to be analysis done, a significant amount of analysis. It's very costly, actually, at the very front end of this whole process, as she was saying, to see what the capacity is of the grid to absorb the type of energy with its particular characteristics in its particular location can be integrated successfully into the grid. Because, as I think Davi said earlier, you know, no developer is going to build a project that only gets to run at like 3% of its capacity because the grid isn't able to absorb the energy it could produce.
That leads to that leads to a question, I think, in the Q&A, which are related to it. How should we answer questions as to where energy being produced from solar and wind in our communities is going? Many people believe the energy being produced by these solar fields is going to another state. So who wants to look like Sherry? You look like you want to chime in first.
Yeah, I would say in Wisconsin, what happens is that private developers will come in, but it's actually the local utilities that are buying the utility scale solar. Sometimes it's 2 utility companies where, like, a smaller one, Madison Gas and Electric, might buy 30% of the megawatts, and, you know, a larger one will buy the other 70%. But in our state anyway, this is the way that our grid is going from fossil fuels and mostly coal to local renewables. And so this is kind of the way the replacement is happening. So even though they're not the ones building the projects, they are the ones then owning.
I could add, you wanted to go, Davi?
Oh, no, you go ahead. I'll add it. Go ahead.
Yes, I'll just add something that may be a little hyper technical, but shouldn't be forgotten at some level, which is once the electrons that are generated by any source enter the grid, nobody's tracking where they go, you know, electron by electron. So you don't actually know. Nobody knows. It's not even really that sensible a question that's hyper technical level to ask, like, where does the electricity that's generated at my facility end up? That said, I think the way Sherry answered is really what underlies the question, which is the way I would frame it more broadly is who's benefiting, whose costs are being affected, whose quality of electricity supply is being influenced. The things that people care about, mostly when they're electricity users, is what I think probably underlies that question more than sort of that hyper technical piece of it.
Yeah, and if I may just add a little. So yes, to all of what was said. So just to zoom out, the best analogy I've heard for the transmission system, you heard me talk about traffic earlier, but for this point, it's kind of like a reservoir. So let me actually share quickly this screen. This is the map that I was describing. This is from FERC. Hold on one second. Okay. This is the map of the regional transmission systems right here. So you could see that in the Southwest, the Northwest, and the Southeast, there is no regional system, but these other ones, these other regions are managed by these regional operators. And each one of those regions is kind of like a reservoir, you could imagine, where there are sources, in the reservoir case, there's streams coming into the reservoir all over the place. And then there's people pulling out cups of water, maybe there's a pipe going out somewhere else. Once the water's coming out of the reservoir, whether it's through the pipe or the cup, you don't know which stream that molecule of water came from. And that's similar to how the grid works. So you don't know, as was being said previously, you don't know where those electrons came from. It's just a really dynamic system. And whoever turns on their light first, the electrons travel the speed of light, something goes there. So it's as was said, you cannot tell exactly where the energy is going unless it's an off-grid system that's powering a specific load. So for example, a really large factory might have its own solar panels that are actually what they call behind the meter. That means that those solar panels are only feeding that facility, and that those are not, on the grid. But that's pretty rare. Most of the projects that you're talking about are on the grid. And to add to what Sherry was saying, Sherry in Wisconsin is in this MISO region. And that in MISO, that is one of the regions where different kinds of buyers of power can contract with projects. So you might have a corporation like Steelcase or Cargill or many of the others that are now buying clean energy. They might buy the power from a generation facility, but there is not a pipe that runs from that generation facility to their plant. That what they're really doing is they're sort of running a financial arbitrage with the grid system to just sort of claim the energy produced by a certain generator. So there's really two stories. There's the economic story about how the energy is traded, and that is a little bit divorced from the physical story of where electrons actually go, but that's how these systems work.
Michael, can I just add one other,
Sure.
which I think is not exactly in response, but I think is really relevant to sort of the community development, community economic development side of things. So almost by definition, with a lot of other kinds of things, we're going to meet our energy goals by locating facilities in rural landscapes to serve urban load, meaning urban consumers. It's not that rural people don't get the electricity, but the land is not there in urban places. So that leads to a lot of the kinds of real and perceptual questions about who bears the benefits, who pays the costs. We do the same thing with food. We do the same thing with tourism. We do the same thing with water supply. We do the same thing with a lot of things where there's kind of uneasy trade-off that rural places make with urban consumers as suppliers and demanders of various kinds of goods. So there's tension there.
Yeah, in some ways, it's really not unlike what's done now with large-scale plants. A lot of hydro supplies multiple states. It's just people are thinking of it differently. Had a question come in the chat. Said someone can ask if someone describe NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and benefits they bring.
Wow.
Well, Sherry, why don't you take that one first?
It's okay. That's such a big question. I think in the context of what we're doing, a lot of the National Renewable Energy Labs are really doing a huge amount of research. They do a lot of research on technologies, but they also have like a social science side to them as well. And so a lot of the federal money is going into grants, like the RSTEP grant that was mentioned, and we did, apply for that, but then, and that's being run by USDOE, EERE, and NREL. But they also get a lot of the federal money to do the research. And so I think it's just been a wealth of really technical information for us to use. There was just a webinar that I went to that LBNL, or Berkeley National Lab, did. So it's not just NREL, I know there are 5 of them, but then what they did is they studied the value of properties around large wind developments, and where they're, what are the effects of the wind developments on property values over what time and on what distance, etc. So they do just wonderful research that's very useful for us, but somebody else could take that too. I'm just trying to localize it to what, how we use it.
I just underscore what you already said, Sherry, about in terms of the concept of community engagement. One of the things I was trying to show, what the federal government is investing, I would say, in an unprecedented way around renewables, and let's call it the social side, socioeconomic element of what's going on with the idea that we're going to transition off of fossil fuels. So, and NREL is one of the major players there. So, they do a lot of technical, sort of like engineering kind of technical work as well, but you highlighted, and I think we're all here to some extent because of the extent that there's leadership at the federal level and trying to understand how people interact with technology.
One related question has come in, is asking if any of you had any, and this comes up with when we're doing renewables, sometimes you get excess and there's energy. Any of you had experience with energy storage projects? And if so, how have communities received them? Any comments on that?
Well, I would say in Wisconsin, I showed we have 13 energy storage projects. Some of them actually came in after the large scale solar was in, and they came in a few years later. I would say, based on what we're looking at here in terms of community engagement, those communities that didn't have kind of the negative, angry, type of interactions over large scale. One of them, I could say, in Wisconsin, where there was education actually that extension led well in advance of the large scale solar, so that people already were educated as to what rights they had, or what they could ask about, or what they could negotiate. And so when the developer came back in and said, or it was actually the utility, that we want to add the storage, what they were able to do was to say, okay, well, these are our concerns. We're concerned about fire. So if there is a fire, will you pay for it? And we want you to pay for it. And here are parameters around that. And what if there's, runoff or an environmental issue, or, fencing, those kinds of things. So they knew that they could be engaged, and we helped them actually put together what the questions would be, and then they could present those and have them addressed. But it was in a very low key exchange. And more we have battery storage happening. A lot of it is actually not just for excess, but there are a lot of times that we're producing more on the grid than we are allowed to use. And so there's storage that happens, and then it also regulates the cloudy days, the the troughs in energy use, the excess in the summer when people are using so much for air conditioning, et cetera. So it's really, storage is hugely important, and I think it's going to be accompanying a lot more projects. And it's the way that this grid is actually going to be able to work, because, people are always saying, well, we need base load because, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. But the fact is, when you combine that with energy storage, battery storage, of which, by the way, there's a huge amount of research going on with that too, to make that more efficient. That's going to be important for us going to a clean grid.
Davi, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I would just add, yeah, battery storage, as David said, battery storage is evolving. It's a newer technology compared to the others. It's only recently become sort of economically viable, so you're seeing more and more of it now. It's really complicated how it gets treated, since as Sherry was describing, it serves multiple purposes depending on how it's being utilized. It can be treated like a generation source and regulated that way, or it can be treated like a capacity service, where it's sort of only being used in these times when it's it's filling a gap somehow. So it's a complicated picture, but I just thought it would be helpful to mention there's sort of two big types of energy storage projects happening now. One is co-located energy storage. So that's where these batteries, which look sort of like large shipping containers or several shipping containers, they are being located where a solar project or a wind project is. In those co-located cases, and in many cases, those are just put sort of in or immediately next to a substation. And in many cases, those look kind of like a piece of the substation. Folks have gotten used to seeing substations around them. They don't always notice them. And this just looks like sort of one more component of what's in that fence. So sometimes that's how it works. There's other places where we're calling it standalone storage. That's happening more and more now. That's where it's not in the same place as a wind or solar project. It's being put in a place on the grid to provide some of these services that Sherry was mentioning, and it's located with that in mind. Increasingly, those projects are located in more urban areas or sort of industrial areas of cities. So that tends to look really different sort of from a community acceptance perspective than these projects that are getting co-located with large renewable generation projects. So you'll see this evolving, but certainly the same kinds of dynamics we've seen around community acceptance of renewables are now showing up on solar as well. And on storage as well. And I'm guessing we'll see more of that.
Okay. Turn it back over to Brad. There's one question, point the presenters may want to answer it in the Q&A. We don't have time to do live, but we are at about time. So Brad, if you want to do the closing rather.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you to David and Sherry and Davi. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today, for investing time in preparing your presentation. Really grateful for that contribution. I want to say thanks on behalf of the entire Land Use Planning Community of Practice Board. Thanks for participants who joined today. We will have a recording of this presentation posted to our webpage on the NACDEP website. That URL is on your screen, and watch for that soon. I'd encourage those still with us, consider joining the Land Use Planning Community of Practice, consider joining the National Extension Climate Initiative, and look for other opportunities to stay engaged on this topic within your own state and nationwide. So this time I'll go ahead.
Evaluation.
One more, Michael, one more point.
I just said, don't forget the evaluation.
Thank you. There is an evaluation. I popped in the chat, and that will appear on your screen as we close out. Thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate contributions here today. Farewell.